When the shooting finally started on Iwo Jima, it didn't come from the beach. It came from the hills. Private Wilson Watson was carrying the heaviest gun in his platoon, a weapon most Marines believed would get you killed faster, not save you. 15 minutes later, 60 Japanese soldiers lay dead around him. Nothing about this fight went the way either side had trained for. No heroic charges, no clever formations, just one man, moving forward with a weapon that was never supposed to work. The beach was supposed to be the most dangerous place on Iwo Jima. Everyone knew that. Amphibious landings always were. So when the first waves reached the black volcanic sand and nothing happened, the silence felt wrong. No machine guns, no mortars, no artillery, just the sound of boots sinking into ash and engines pulling away from the shore. Private Wilson Watson moved inland with his platoon, the Browning automatic rifle hanging heavy across his chest. 20 pounds of steel, another 15 pounds of ammunition. Every step reminded him why most Marines hated the BAR. It slowed you down. It pulled at your shoulders. It punished hesitation. Men with M1 Garands moved more freely, rifles held close, packs lighter. They spread out instinctively, looking for cover that didn't exist. The terrain offered nothing. No trees, no solid earth, just broken rock and soft sand that swallowed movement and returned nothing. The hills ahead looked dead. They weren't. The Japanese had learned that meeting Marines on the beach was suicide. They had stopped trying. Instead, they watched. From tunnels carved into volcanic stone, from caves invisible to aerial photographs, from firing positions registered months in advance. They waited until the Marines were far enough inland that retreat no longer mattered. Then the hills opened fire. Mortar rounds fell without warning. Not random, precise. Machine guns flashed from slopes that had looked empty seconds earlier. Fire crossed fire. Routes of movement collapsed instantly. Men dropped where they stood. Watson followed his squad toward a low rise marked on maps as Hill 203. The BAR dragged as he climbed, its weight working against every instinct to move faster. Lighter rifles reached cover first. They were also the first to be pinned. Enemy fire didn't stay long enough to be answered. Short bursts, then silence. Return fire drew mortars. Stillness became just as dangerous as movement. Watson reached the slope of the hill and dropped behind broken rock, breathing hard. The bar rested across his knees, solid, unforgiving. He knew what the manuals said. He knew what training demanded. Find a position, set the bipod, establish fire. But nothing on that hillside matched the conditions those rules were written for. The enemy wasn't holding ground. They were revealing it for seconds at a time, and every second mattered. The first Japanese machine gun opened fire less than 60 yards ahead. Watson reacted the way he had been taught. It would be the last time that day he did. The machine gun fired again. This time, Watson could see it. A brief flash at the mouth of a cave, halfway up the slope. 60 yards. Too close to ignore. Watson dropped prone behind volcanic rock and swung the BAR forward. The weight settled into the ground the way it always did. Solid, stable. He kicked the bipod down and lined up the sights. This was how it was supposed to work. The BAR barked in controlled bursts, the recoil absorbed by the weapon's mass. Rounds struck stone around the cave entrance. The firing stopped. For a moment, it felt right. Then the air changed. A dull thump echoed behind him. Another followed, closer. Watson rolled as the first mortar round landed where he had been lying seconds earlier. Black sand sprayed upward, burning hot. He crawled, then crawled again. The second round landed where his bipod had been. The third was closer still. The lesson came fast. Staying still had made him visible. The machine gun reappeared. Watson didn't have time to set up again. He rose to one knee and fired without the bipod, the BAR heavy in his hands. The recoil pushed back harder now, but the weight kept the muzzle down. The Japanese crew fired once more and vanished into the cave. Watson moved, not to find a better position, not to hold ground, just to get away from where he had been. Around him, Marines were trying to do the same thing. Men with rifles fired carefully aimed shots at flashes that were already gone. Each pause drew fire. Each attempt to settle into cover marked a position. Watson reached another outcropping and checked his magazine. 1 gone. 19 rounds, used in less than a minute. He had 11 magazines left. That number already felt smaller than it should have. The machine gun opened again, this time from a different angle. The sound was closer. Watson didn't go prone. He stood and fired while stepping forward, short bursts aimed at the cave mouth. The BAR shook his arms, but the rounds landed where he pointed them. The firing stopped again. Watson didn't wait to see if it would return. He advanced. Each step was heavy, each burst shorter than the last. The cave entrance filled his sights. At 20 yards, he emptied the magazine. When the echoes died, the position stayed silent. 8 Japanese soldiers lay in front of the cave. Watson reloaded behind rock that wasn't cover so much as coincidence. 10 magazines left. The hill hadn't gone quiet. It was adjusting, and so was he. The silence didn't mean the hill was clear. It meant the hill was watching. Watson stayed low and shifted position again, dragging the BAR across jagged rock. The weapon scraped stone, loud in the brief quiet. He didn't stop. The last exchange had shown him something simple. Fire came when he stayed in one place. It stopped when he didn't. Movement bought seconds. Seconds kept you alive. A burst of rifle fire cracked from his left. Watson turned and fired without dropping prone. Short, controlled bursts. The bar's weight pulled the muzzle down instead of letting it climb. The firing ceased. He moved again. Japanese soldiers appeared in pairs now, not in groups. They fired quickly and vanished into openings that hadn't been there moments before. Watson chased the sound. Each time he advanced, the enemy pulled back, not in panic, in adjustment. They were trying to draw him into angles they controlled. The bar made that harder. At close range, automatic fire-filled spaces rifles couldn't. Another cave mouth flashed ahead. Watson fired as he advanced, stepping into the recoil. The weapon stayed level, the rounds stitching stone around the opening. He closed the distance fast. At 15 yards, the cave emptied. 2 men fell. Another tried to retreat. Watson fired once more. The cave went dark. He didn't pause to count bodies. He checked his ammunition. 2 magazines gone now. 9 left. That number mattered more than the dead. Mortar rounds fell again, closer than before. The Japanese were responding to movement, not position. Watson used that. He fired, shifted, fired, again, never from the same place, twice. Each burst forced heads down. Each step denied the enemy time to coordinate. Other Marines began moving when he moved. Pinned men found seconds to relocate. Routes that had been sealed reopened briefly. Watson wasn't leading them. He was pulling the hill apart. The enemy tried to counter. A squad rushed forward from a tunnel opening, rifles up. Watson waited until they were fully exposed, then fired continuously for 3 seconds. They dropped where they stood. The rest scattered back into the hill. Watson reloaded behind rock that barely reached his chest. 8 magazines left. The bar was no longer a burden. It was an anchor, heavy enough to control, loud enough to dominate space. The hill didn't fire blindly anymore. It was careful, and careful meant slow. Watson advanced again. He didn't know it yet. But the next mortar round would change everything. The mortar round landed behind Watson. The blast was close enough to lift him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, the BAR slamming against his chest. For a second, there was no sound, only pressure. When his hearing came back, the hill was screaming. A Marine lay twisted a few yards away, unmoving. Another crawled blindly, shouting for someone who didn't answer. Watson looked toward where the platoon runner had been. The field telephone wire lay in pieces, torn and buried under black sand. No radio, no orders coming. The hill had just cut them off. Japanese fire resumed, sharper now, more confident. Machine guns from 2 directions. Rifle fire from higher ground. Watson moved without thinking, dragging the BAR to another outcropping. The weapon felt heavier again, but he didn't slow. He fired at a muzzle flash and shifted immediately. A second flash appeared where he had been. They were tracking patterns now. Watson changed them. Other Marines were scattered across the slope, each pinned behind whatever cover they'd found. They fired when they could, then went still. Watson didn't. He fired to move. Each burst wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to interrupt, to force heads down, to buy time. The Japanese tried to reoccupy positions they thought were clear. Watson saw them moving through tunnels, emerging cautiously. He fired before they could settle. The bar roared, and the hill answered with silence. Watson reloaded again. 7 magazines left. The number sat heavy in his head. A group of Japanese soldiers appeared downslope, advancing carefully, rifles low. They weren't rushing. They believed the Americans were finished. Watson let them come closer. When he fired, the slope emptied in seconds. Bodies rolled down the incline, stopping against rock. Watson moved again. Not forward this time, sideways. The hill tried to answer, but the fire came late, hitting where he had been. He was alone now, not by design, by circumstance. The platoon had dissolved into individuals, each fighting their own corner of the hill. Watson wasn't holding Hill 203. He was contesting it, step by step. Another mortar fell nearby, throwing fragments across the slope. One tore through his shoulder. The pain came sharp and immediate, burning through muscle. Watson gritted his teeth and forced himself upright. He checked his arm. It still moved. That was enough. 6 magazines left. The hill hadn't broken, but it was no longer sure, and neither side could afford to be wrong much longer. The pain didn't fade. It settled in. Watson pressed his back into the rock and forced air into his lungs. His left shoulder burned with every movement, the BAR's sling biting into torn muscle. He reached for a fresh magazine. His hand missed the first time. The second try was slower. By the time the magazine locked in place, he understood something new. Reloading would take longer now, much longer. Japanese voices carried up the slope, close, calm. They were coordinating. Watson fired a short burst toward the sound and moved before the echoes faded. The BAR felt heavier than it had minutes earlier. He shifted his grip to keep the muzzle steady. The pain sharpened, but the round stayed low. A Japanese squad emerged from a tunnel, opening 30 yards downslope. They advanced carefully, using rock for cover, spacing themselves out. They had adapted. Watson waited until the lead man stepped into open ground. Then he fired. The first burst dropped 2. The rest scattered, hugging stone that offered no real protection. Watson didn't stay to finish it. He moved. Every step was deliberate now. Not fast. Controlled. The hill tried to answer him. Rifle fire snapped overhead. Fragments chipped rock near his face. Watson dropped to one knee and fired again. Short bursts aimed where movement had been. The firing stopped. He reloaded. It took too long. A grenade exploded nearby, the shockwave slamming him against the ground. Fragments tore into his leg, hot and sharp. Watson dragged himself behind cover, teeth clenched, breath ragged. He checked his leg, bleeding, but it still worked. That was enough. 5 magazines left. The number wasn't abstract anymore. It was a limit. Japanese soldiers advanced again, this time from 2 directions. They believed he was slowing. They were right. They believed that would save them. It didn't. Watson fired only when he had to now, each burst shorter, each target chosen. He moved after every exchange, leaving behind the place the enemy expected him to be. The BAR no longer felt like a tool for dominance. It felt like a timer. Every round spent mattered. Every second wasted would be paid for in blood. Watson reached a shallow depression near the crest of the hill and paused. The fire slackened, not because the hill was clear, because it was deciding. 4 magazines left. Watson adjusted the sling, ignoring the pain tearing through his shoulder. He wasn't winning. He was surviving. And survival was about to become much more expensive. The hill shifted, not suddenly, deliberately. Fire didn't come from one direction anymore. It came in turns. A burst from the left. Silence. Then movement from the right. Watson understood what was happening. They were feeling him out, testing how fast he could move, how often he could fire, how long it took him to reload. He answered with restraint. When a helmet appeared above the rock line, Watson fired once. Not a spray, a single burst. The figure dropped out of sight. Watson moved. He didn't wait for confirmation. He never did now. Another group appeared lower on the slope, advancing in bounds. One moved, another covered. They were patient. Watson let them get closer. At 25 yards, he opened fire. The BAR roared, heavy and steady, the recoil driving into his shoulder like a hammer. 2 men fell. The rest froze. Watson stopped firing. The silence was intentional. He moved again, dragging his wounded leg, leaving behind the position they had marked. Japanese fire answered where he had been. Too late. Watson reloaded. 4 magazines left. Time collapsed into fragments. Fire. Move. Reload. Breathe. A Japanese squad rushed from a tunnel opening, faster than the others. They believed speed would overwhelm him. Watson met them head on. He fired continuously for 3 seconds. When the burst ended, nothing moved. The smell of cordite hung in the air, thick and bitter. Watson checked his ammo. 3 magazines left. That was when he realized it. This wasn't a series of skirmishes anymore. It was one fight. One continuous engagement that had no clear start and no clear end. The Japanese were committing more men, not all at once, enough to see if pressure would break him. Watson shifted again, climbing toward the crest of the hill. Each step sent pain through his leg. He ignored it. From the higher ground, he could see movement across the slope, shadows passing between rocks, heads appearing briefly before dropping back. They were circling. Watson fired to his right and moved left, then fired left and moved forward. The bar dictated the rhythm. The enemy followed it. 2 magazines left. The hill went quiet, not empty, watching. Watson crouched behind a broken stone, breathing through clenched teeth. He didn't know how long he had been fighting, only that it wasn't over, and that the next exchange would decide whether 15 minutes were enough. The shot came from above. Watson never saw the flash. He felt the impact first. The round tore through his shoulder and spun him sideways into the rock. The BAR clattered against stone, heavy and loud. For a moment, the hill disappeared. When it came back, the pain followed deep, burning, relentless. Watson stayed still, not because he wanted to, because moving meant bleeding faster. Japanese voices echoed again, closer now. They had seen him fall. They believed the fight was over. Watson pulled himself upright and dragged the BAR back into position. His left arm barely cooperated, the muscle refusing clean movement. He tested the trigger. It still worked. That was enough. A grenade exploded to his right, showering him with fragments. One sliced into his leg, hot and sharp. Watson clenched his jaw and waited for the noise to fade. Then he fired. Short bursts. Measured. The Japanese advance slowed immediately. Men dropped into cover that offered no safety. The bar's fire reached them anyway. Watson moved again, awkward now, favoring his leg, the sling cutting into his wounded shoulder. Reloading took forever. His fingers fumbled with the magazine, slick with blood. By the time the weapon was ready again, he understood the math. 2 magazines left. Japanese soldiers advanced in a wider arc, trying to surround him. They were careful now. They knew he was hurt. They believed patience would finish it. Watson didn't give them time. He fired at one group, then shifted toward another, forcing them to react instead of plan. Each burst was shorter than the last, each movement more deliberate. The pain narrowed his focus. There was no hill anymore, no battle, just angles, distances, seconds. Watson reached a shallow depression near the crest and dropped into it hard. The BAR rested across his knees, steady despite his shaking hands. 1 magazine left, 20 rounds. He listened. Footsteps on stone. Voices calling out, confident now. They were coming from multiple directions. Watson waited. When the first figure stepped into view, he fired 2 bursts and moved immediately. Return fire tore into the spot he had just left. Watson reloaded his last magazine, slowly, carefully, every movement costing him. The weapon clicked into place. The BAR felt different now, lighter, emptying. Watson looked down the slope one last time. The hill was closing in, and this time, there would be no room left to move. Watson settled behind the rock and locked the last magazine into place. 20 rounds. No spars. The BAR felt lighter now, almost fragile. The weight that had once anchored it replaced by a hollow sense of finality. The hill was no longer probing. It was committing. Japanese soldiers moved from 3 directions at once, spreading out, using the terrain carefully. They had learned. They didn't rush. They advanced in steps, one element moving while another covered. Watson waited. He let the first group get close enough that there was no room for retreat. Then he fired. The bar thundered, the recoil slamming into his shoulder, pain flaring white-hot. 2 men fell immediately. A third dropped behind rock that didn't stop the rounds. Watson stopped firing and moved. He had learned that firing was only half the act. Movement was the rest. Rifle fire snapped overhead as he dragged himself to a new position, volcanic stone scraping against his wounded leg. The Japanese returned fire where he had been. Too late. Watson fired again, shorter this time. 3 rounds. Then silence. He could feel the magazine emptying. The enemy hesitated. They had expected a wounded Marine to stay in place. To defend, Watson did neither. He advanced. Every step was slow. Every burst calculated. He fired only when a body appeared fully exposed. No warning shots. No wasted rounds. At close range, the BAR was brutal. A Japanese soldier broke from cover, trying to close the distance. Watson fired once. The man fell hard, sliding down the slope. The hill echoed with shouting, now. Orders passed, quickly, urgently. They were running out of patience. Watson was running out of ammunition. He checked the count without looking. Half a magazine left. Japanese fire intensified, bullets chipping rock around him, fragments cutting into already torn skin. Watson crouched low and waited. When 3 soldiers appeared together, moving fast, he fired his longest burst of the fight. The BAR roared, the magazine nearly empty when he released the trigger. Silence followed. Watson stood there, breathing hard, the weapon sagging in his hands. He squeezed the trigger again. Nothing. The magazine was empty. The hill went quiet, not because the enemy was gone, but because they had lost track of where he was. Watson let the BAR drop and leaned against the rock, blood soaking into the black sand beneath him. The 15 minutes were over. What remained was waiting. The silence lasted longer than Watson expected. Not the pause between bursts, not the kind that meant reloading. This was different. He stayed where he was, pressed into the rock, chest rising and falling in shallow pulls. His hands shook now that there was nothing left to fire. Voices drifted up the slope, lower than before, cautious. No one rushed him. Watson didn't move. Minutes passed without gunfire. Mortars stayed silent. Rifle shots cracked far off, somewhere else on the island. The hill had shifted its attention. Watson tried to stand, and nearly fell. His leg refused clean movement. His shoulder burned when he put weight on it. He stayed down. From where he lay, he could see bodies scattered across the slope, some close, some farther down, half hidden by rock. Weapons lay where they had been dropped, Type 99 rifles, a machine gun tipped on its side near a cave mouth. No one came back for them. Watson didn't count. He didn't need to. The absence of fire told him enough. Eventually, movement appeared from behind him, slow, careful. A Marine crawled up from lower ground, rifle slung awkwardly. Then another. They stopped when they saw Watson, eyes fixed on the BAR lying empty beside him. One of them spoke, but Watson didn't hear the words. More Marines followed, spreading out, checking the slope. They moved without urgency now. The hill didn't answer. Someone knelt beside Watson and tried to speak again. Watson shook his head and pointed weakly downhill. The Marines looked. They didn't say anything. A stretcher arrived later, carried by men who had moved too long under fire to be surprised by much anymore. They lifted Watson carefully. The pain came back all at once. As they carried him down the slope, he saw the hill from a different angle. The paths he had crossed, the places he had fired from, it looked smaller now. Hours later, when the fighting pushed past Hill 203, officers walked the ground Watson had held. They found the evidence before they found explanations. Spent brass scattered across rock, empty magazines. Positions abandoned mid-movement. The count came later. 60 Japanese casualties within a space barely 100 yards across. An entire company's advance stopped cold by a man who had no rounds left to fire. The reports would be written carefully, measured, clean. They would never capture the sound of the hill going quiet, or the moment when it didn't come back. The hill was examined the way battlefields always are, slowly, carefully, and too late to matter. Officers moved through the area Watson had held, stopping where the fighting had been thickest. They didn't need maps. The ground told the story. Spent brass lay everywhere, scattered in arcs that marked where Watson had fired while moving. Empty bar magazines were found in places no one would normally reload. Behind rocks too small to be cover, near cave mouths, halfway up exposed slopes. The pattern didn't match training manuals. Machine gun positions had been neutralized at distances considered reckless. Rifle fire had been cut short, not by suppression from fixed positions, but by pressure that never stayed in one place. Inside one bunker, 12 Japanese soldiers were found dead. Enough ammunition remained to hold the position for hours. They never got the chance. The BAR lay where Watson had dropped it, dusted with black sand. An ordnance specialist picked it up and worked the action. It cycled smoothly. The barrel showed normal wear. No warping. No failure. The weapon that had been criticized for overheating had not overheated at all. Someone counted the magazines. Nearly all were empty. By standard measures, the ammunition expenditure was excessive, irresponsible, even. But the results were undeniable. An entire Japanese advance had collapsed. Not slowed, not redirected, stopped. The casualty estimates varied, but the number settled around 60. Some killed outright, others wounded badly enough to be pulled back through tunnels and never return. The hill was secure. Watson was already gone by the time the assessments were finished. On the hospital ship offshore, surgeons worked through the damage. The shoulder wound had shattered muscle. The leg injury was deep, but survivable. They said he was lucky. Watson didn't argue. Back on Iwo Jima, reports moved up the chain of command. They focused on bravery, on endurance. But between the lines, something else stood out. The weapon hadn't failed. The user hadn't panicked. And the enemy had not adapted quickly enough to what they were facing. The ground showed movement where doctrine expected stillness, fire where planners expected caution. No one wrote that down directly, but everyone who walked that hill saw it. The fight hadn't been won by holding position. It had been won by refusing to stay in one. The official reports didn't use the word doctrine. What have to get to? They never did. They spoke instead of courage, of determination under fire, of a wounded Marine who refused to withdraw. That was safe language. It didn't challenge anyone, but the men who read the reports noticed what wasn't said. They noticed where the fighting had happened, how close the engagements were, how often the BAR had been fired while moving, not from cover. No order went out declaring a new way to fight. There was no memo, but small things began to change. Bar gunners were pushed forward instead of held back. Ammunition loads quietly increased. Squad leaders stopped insisting on fixed firing positions when the terrain didn't allow them. Training exercises adjusted without explanation. Instructors stopped correcting Marines who fired on the move, stopped yelling when automatic weapons advanced ahead of riflemen. They watched instead. What worked stayed. What didn't disappeared. Watson's name came up now and then, usually at the end of conversations, as an example, not as a rule. No one wanted to say out loud that the manuals had been wrong. But everyone who had been on Iwo Jima understood the difference between what they had practiced and what had kept them alive. The Pacific didn't allow long-range fights. It didn't reward patience. It punished hesitation. BARs that had once been seen as burdens were redistributed, not to everyone, to Marines who knew how to keep moving under fire. The weapon itself didn't change. Its role did. Watson never saw any of this. By the time he was strong enough to sit up on the hospital ship, the battle had moved inland. The island was still burning. The hill he had held was already just another grid reference. The Medal of Honor citation was written weeks later. It described what he did. It did not explain why it worked. That part was left out, not intentionally. It simply wasn't how wars recorded their lessons. Those lessons moved quietly, from unit to unit, from sergeant to sergeant, passed along without names. What mattered wasn't who had fought on Hill 203. What mattered was that men who read those reports stopped fighting the way they had been taught and started fighting the way the ground demanded. No announcement was ever made, but the change had already taken place. By the time the lesson spread, the war was already moving past it. In the final months of the Pacific Campaign, planners were looking ahead to lighter weapons, faster movement, cleaner doctrines. The Browning automatic rifle didn't fit that future. It was heavy. It consumed ammunition. It demanded strength and discipline that peacetime armies preferred to avoid. Quietly, decisions were made. The bar would be phased out, not because it had failed, but because it no longer matched the war people wanted to prepare for. What happened on Hill 203 didn't stop that process. Watson's fight had proven what the weapon could do under the worst conditions imaginable. It had shown how close combat actually unfolded when terrain erased theory. But those truths arrived at the wrong moment. Doctrine changes slowly. Procurement changes faster. By March of 1945, new rifles were already being discussed. Lighter, more manageable, easier to train with. Weapons designed for a war that hadn't happened yet. Watson never argued for the BAR. He didn't write papers. He didn't lecture. He recovered, slowly, from wounds that would end his frontline service. The hill faded into memory. On Iwo Jima, the fighting dragged on for weeks after he was evacuated. Thousands more would die clearing caves and tunnels the same way. Up close, under fire, in conditions no manual had prepared them for. The lesson Watson had learned in 15 minutes was learned again and again by others, sometimes too late, sometimes at the cost of lives that never made it into reports. The BAR disappeared from American arsenals not long after the war. Its reputation followed it. Too heavy, too outdated, a relic of another time. Hill 203 was rarely mentioned, not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't fit the story people preferred to tell of clean progress, steady improvement, and doctrines that evolved on schedule. The truth was less orderly. Sometimes a war reveals its secrets only in moments of desperation. Sometimes the right answer appears just as everyone stops looking for it. On a volcanic hill on Iwo Jima, one Marine carried a weapon that was never supposed to work. For 15 minutes, it did, and then it was set aside. Not because it was wrong, but because the lesson arrived too late to change the ending.